years. The minister talks about limited resources and setting priorities. The minister, Mr. Speaker, has a choice of where to spend that $500,000. It could be to purchase lunch bags or of trinkets for 4-year-olds, or it could be to begin the implementation of recommendations designated or designed to protect our students from bullying and to make our schools safe. So my question to the minister, which of these is your priority, her priority?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The overall well-being of every student in our system is paramount. As a public school system, there are many components of our education program that need to be taken care of. Now, I would like to stand on record that it is not fair to name a resource that's going in the hands of our youngest students, an investment in the hands of our youngest students, as a lunch bag. It is these are resources that, coming from the work with the early intervention teachers in our province, and recognizing this as resources that enable families to engage in literacy activities. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the recent New Brunswick NDP convention last week in St. John, newly minted federal leader Thomas Mulcair came out firing against shale gas exploration, and I would like to read a quote that he made to CBC. Mr. Mulcair goes on to say, "These are families that have been on the same land and farmed the same land, not just for generations, but for centuries in some cases. So people are very close to their land, and they don't want to see it destroyed by carpetbaggers coming in from other places to make a quick buck, who leave the mess for future generations to clean up. There will be no sustainable wealth created here, and they'll leave the cleanup to New Brunswickers." Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Energy is that does he concur with the message that the newly federal NDP leader has and the characterization of the companies that do these practices?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. I certainly respect the leadership of Mr. Mulcair and the opportunity that he's given to Canadians to make an informed decision. But this government here has never, ever approved hydraulic fracturing. We take the seriousness of the communities around drinking water and groundwater, and we've undertaken a review in both the Department of Energy and in the Department of the Environment, and that review still needs more good information, so we're going to make an informed decision after we gather all the information that's available out there to us.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North on his first supplementary.
With the joint announcement by the Departments of Energy and Environment on April 16th to extend the review for hydraulic fracturing to mid-2014, a review that was due out weeks from now, it has led many Nova Scotians to be concerned again with the NDP government and this minister putting off another report that is key to the future of the environment of this province. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain to the House why his government has pushed the report into the future? Was it simply to gather more information, or the fact that Triangle Petroleum is now speaking out in frustration and is threatening to pull out of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly the last thing we want to see is any harm to our environment or to our drinking water. That's why we've undertaken this review at this time. And we know there's a number of reports out there from the Environmental Protection Association, Environment Canada, and in jurisdictions such as New York and Quebec and New Brunswick and so on, good, valuable information that we need in order to make the right decision for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, with Triangle Petroleum threatening to hand the lease back to the province and make a complete exit, can the Minister of Energy ensure the House and all Nova Scotians that if indeed Triangle pulls out, he will ensure that they return the pristine lands they have disrupted, be returned to their original state, and that the cleanup not be a burden to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said before, we're not going to approve any hydraulic fracturing during the period of this review. We'll continue to work with proponents out there, including Triangle Petroleum and others, as we have been doing over the last number of months. And I understand that they have been issued an order to clean up any sites there in the Hants County area, and they are required to comply, and I'm sure they will. But I'll repeat again, we're not going to allow hydraulic fracturing until the review is finished.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April the 11th, the Minister of Education announced in a release that she was allocating money, and I quote, a new small school isolated schools supplement. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that there is no new money in this supplement, and what she was really announcing was simply a change in branding. My question to the Minister, will the Education Minister confirm that there is no new money in this supplement?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. Through our funding formula, there is an allocation going out for small isolated schools, which I have had the opportunity to explain during estimates that this government recognizes that schools that are small, especially our small high schools and isolated schools, come with an extra cost to school boards. So it's included in the formula. Under the other formula, there were 44 schools identified. Under the new formula, there are 98 schools within the province of Nova Scotia that do receive some extra funds to their boards to support them with the small isolated schools. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this rebranding was announced on April the 11th. We are hearing quite clearly from school boards that this announcement does nothing to change their bottom line. With no new money in this supplement, the schools are still facing the same cost pressures. This is as much of an attempt at rebranding as it was the name change of the IEF. Mr. Speaker, fancy slogans are not going to keep rural schools from closing. My question to the Minister, will the Minister explain to rural Nova Scotia communities how a rebranding exercise with no new money will keep their schools from closing?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. I guess I will have to disagree with the member about the funding around this. We recognize that small schools, especially small high schools and isolated schools, do come at an extra cost to school boards. So it's included in the funding formula, and that envelope of money is provided to those school boards that have those schools that are small high schools, small schools, and isolated schools. There are 98 schools now that have been identified, and the envelopes of money have gone to each of the school boards. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, obviously, it's nothing new that the Minister would disagree with school boards who see no change in their bottom line. Some of the schools who qualified for the funding were voted for closure before the announcement even came out. AVRSB voted to permanently close Annapolis Royal and Newport Station District School on March 22nd. Then this announcement comes on April 11th with no new money, but yet the Newport Station appears on the qualifying list in the press release. Mr. Speaker, this is not the only school slated for closure which the Minister cites as qualifying for this rebranded supplement. This is entirely misleading and is only meant to help her public relations image. So the question to the Minister, why is the Minister more interested in public relations than she is in public education?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. School boards identified to me over the course of my mandate around the former HOG formula as being problematic. And the department staff worked with the school boards on 24 different meetings that took a number of months. And we redesigned the funding formula to make sure that we were able to fund the school boards appropriately and in the manner in which they wished. So there is a funding line in the formula now for small isolated schools. And so we listened to the school boards and we worked together and we now have a revised formula. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
The NDP came to power with much help from students and their parents. The NDP once called for a 10% tuition reduction, rolled back fees, and publicly pondered why Nova Scotia could not have behaved more like Newfoundland and rolled tuition back by more than 22%. Today, we learned that Dalhousie University is increasing both its tuition and student fees by 3%, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister, is the NDP spoke so loudly about the cost of university in opposition. Why is she governing over a tuition hike today?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, we value our university and community college system in this province. And over the years, we've built up a tremendous high-quality system, but at a cost that Nova Scotians can't afford to sustain into the future. So we sat down with the universities and we co-signed a memorandum of understanding whereby the universities are going to work alongside government to protect their excellence and quality, we put a cap on tuition to protect the affordability and accessibility for students, and we're working in partnership to maintain this system well into the future. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what this government fails to realize is that Nova Scotia can't afford to lose more out of its education system.
That's right.
Our future is entirely dependent on how we treat our education system, Mr. Speaker. And this government's decisions are directly responsible for increased cost education in the province. The province's funding cuts to university has caused a $6.9 million shortfall, a shortfall being paid for by students and their families at Dalhousie University. We know that primary to 12 education is not a priority for this government, and now $75 million in post-secondary cuts shows that PSE is not a priority for this government either. My question for the minister is, why is this government actively making decisions that are making a university degree more expensive in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, the evidence when we came into government was that government funding had increased without the accountability mechanisms in place. In fact, between 1999 and 2009, government funding to universities increased by 77%, but enrollments only grew by 13%. So we are trying to manage the system, protect the quality and affordability at a rate that Nova Scotian taxpayers can afford. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to chastise previous governments for increasing investment in education is a shameful thing indeed, especially coming from a party who in opposition championed affordable education. I have a quote here from the now Minister of Transportation when he said, "You better guard your wallet, students, because you are going to get whacked." Mr. Speaker, this government continues to make decisions that impact costs associated with post-secondary education and financial pressures on parents and students. My question for the minister is, why is the transportation minister once accused the Conservative government of doing, is this government intent on whacking post-secondary students and their parents? And I'll table those comments for the House's view.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to say that we have set aside a sum of $25 million to help our universities look towards an innovative and visionary system in this province. Last year, we provided close to $50 million new dollars for for student assistance and to replace the end of the bursary program, which was the highest single investment in post-secondary education for student assistance in the history of universities. We have capped student debt. We are making a number of significant improvements, and we have committed, we've maintained our commitment to keeping the undergraduate tuition costs for Nova Scotia students and Nova Scotia universities to maintain at or below the national average. All of this in a time of very scarce public dollars. So we are both protecting public taxpayer and we're protecting our university system. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we all know, contract negotiations between the Capital District Health Authority and the NSGU remain stalled. A potential strike by 3,600 vital healthcare support workers, including LPNs, occupational therapists, and medical laboratory technologists, is a week away. People are starting to have their surgeries cancelled, and the health authorities preparing to move as many people out as possible, maybe even before they are ready to go home. Mr. Speaker, how long does the minister think the system can sustain a strike from these very essential healthcare workers?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And Mr. Speaker, as the Premier said earlier in question period, we are very aware of the situation. We are concerned about the impact that a labor disruption would have on the healthcare system. We recognize that many people are concerned, particularly patients in the system and their families, and we would encourage the parties to get back to the table and work their differences out.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for her answer. But you know, there's 9,000 people already on the surgery wait list. Apparently 700 surgeries will have to be cancelled each day of the strike. The system and the system itself can't make up for those cancellations without pushing them further and further out. So my question to the minister is, you know, what's her plan to, outside of just, you know, calling on those parties to get back together, what is she going to do to ensure that those parties get back together?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it is the case that the Capital District have a plan that they are in the stages of putting into place. It's a plan that is prudent to have and is necessary to have, as we're in a very critical point in the collective bargaining process. And again, I really am not going to insert myself into a process where I encourage the parties to get back to the table and work their differences out.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. This is a matter of lives in some cases, depending on the surgeries that those individuals might require. We all know that healthcare workers are very well represented at the table. The health authority is well represented at the table. But the ones that, of course, are left out sort of in that equation is the public. And I think it's the minister's responsibility to protect public. There are all the options, my question to the minister, are all options truly on the table for this minister, including back-to-work legislation, as was suggested in today's Chronicle Herald editorial, which was called Health Bargaining, Public Comes First, or is she willing to see a strike go on for days or even weeks before the government takes action?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to assure the member and all members that public safety in the healthcare system is indeed my #1 priority. And again, I am encouraging the parties to settle out their differences through the collective bargaining process. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Mr. Speaker, it's not only our universities that are facing increased costs as a result of this government's decisions. The Nova Scotia Community College has laid off 8 college prep coordinators as a result of a $5.37 million budget shortfall as a result of this government's cuts. These coordinators worked in junior high schools to encourage students to stay in school, to know their options upon high school graduation, and provide information to students for career planning. This initiative prepared junior and senior high school students for admission to programs at NSCC's 13 campuses, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education is, if the college prep program has been eliminated, who's going to do this vitally important work in our schools?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start off by commending the Nova Scotia Community College for taking a very thorough and responsible view in terms of their budget. I'm sure everybody in this chamber agrees that it's an excellent training institution, and it's one whose work and contribution to this province is very much appreciated by all parties and by all citizens. And certainly, I think it's probably been 10 or 12 years since it evolved from the former vocational school system, and it's been doing a tremendous job. Like other service deliverers, the government has asked the community college to look at efficiencies, to continue to review its programs, to look at its administrative costs, and to thoroughly assess what they're doing, how they're doing it, and whether it's relevant and necessary with budget restrictions. And certainly they, I think, have come up with a package that satisfies all those requirements. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister might appreciate the cuts that NCC is being forced to make, but I assure the minister that parents and students don't appreciate how this government is treating the education system in this province. Not only will we not have those incredibly important prep coordinators in our schools anymore, the college will also introduce a $100 student fee to cover things like convocations and ID cards. Mr. Speaker, students and their families are finding it harder to cover the rising costs of education, and still the minister shows no support for core funding to our institutions. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia needs tradespeople, and we need a government who is going to invest in ensuring that Nova Scotians have access to quality trades educations. At a time when our workforce needs tradespeople, why is this minister cutting the budget for Nova Scotia Community College and making it more difficult for students to access these opportunities?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like all government departments, like all third-party service providers across this province, everyone has taken up the challenge of looking for operational efficiencies. At the same time, we realize that new investments need to be made, and certainly we have made an additional investment in the community college that protects the trades and is helping to get Nova Scotians prepared for the economic opportunities that are on our horizon. I don't believe there's any body or institution or organization in Nova Scotia that would not benefit from a review to make sure that what they offer and how they offer it is efficient and effective. And certainly, again, I want to commend the community college for taking a very thorough and professional attitude. And certainly, no reduction or change is a happy occasion for people who are used to that way of doing it. But we have to look to the what benefits Nova Scotians, and that certainly is their objective as well as the government's objective. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what's confusing to members of this caucus is that at a time of fiscal constraint, when our programs and services are being cut out of our education system, administration costs for the Department of Labour and Advanced Education have increased by 35% in this year's budget, Mr. Speaker. That's what's confusing to this caucus. My question to the minister is, why is the department asking colleges and universities to do more with less when their own administration budget was increased by over 35% this year?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Well, certainly I would be pleased to provide details and an explanation to that during my estimates. But I just want to say at a higher level that I think everyone in this chamber is aware that we've been reorganizing how we deliver services throughout government. Certainly there have been a number of changes and additional responsibilities and reallocation of staff and resources throughout government. Many of them have landed in the Department of Labour and Advanced Education, and certainly I will be able to explain during estimates exactly which changes have taken place. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Nova Scotia College of Art and Design recently released its response to the Windsor Report and its many recommendations for NSCAD to address its financial concerns. Some of these recommendations include looking to other institutions for possible collaborations and even a potential merger. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education tell members of this House, does the NDP government support an independent NSCAD or not?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier and I and our government have been on record for a long time saying that we support NASCAD and we support quality fine arts education in this province. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've had to invest an extra $6 million in order to allow NASCAD to meet their budget requirements. This is not sustainable. And certainly we've put a number of support measures in place to help the Board of Governors and senior administration look at their budget and try to reframe NASCAD in a way that's affordable, continues to provide quality education, but still is affordable for this province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister and the Premier might be on the record supporting NASCAD, but this government's been in place for 3 years and to date has done nothing to address the fundamental issue affecting NASCAD, which is the funding formula. Mr. Speaker, the students and administration of NASCAD have been raising concerns about the funding formula for the university for several years, and still this government has done nothing. If the Minister was so concerned with the future of NASCAD, why did she not act earlier instead of giving the institution a 3-month window to come up with solutions to problems that were years in the making, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's been working with NASCAD for over 2 years, and I think we're now gradually getting to a point where everyone recognizes that really tough decisions need to be made. The report, sustainability report, was delivered to my office before the end of March. We have staff looking at it very carefully. We are in contact with the NASCAD officials, and we will work alongside them to support them in developing the road ahead. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
The Minister is still missing the fundamental issue affecting NASCAD, and which would ensure that important institution in this province can remain independent, and that's the funding formula. It doesn't take into consideration the real costs associated with delivering that form of education in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That's the fundamental problem. And as a result, tuitions will continue to rise at NASCAD, and so will fees. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister tell the students of NASCAD that she will see to it that their tuitions will not go through the roof, that their student fees won't continue to climb, and that their school will be adequately funded by addressing the fundamental issue, and that's the funding formula in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's not one person or one family, one business or one institution in this province that can be given a blank check. And so we are making sure that everything NASCAD needs to do to remain viable, to provide quality fine arts education in this province are in place. We will support them, and that's one reason we've been taking our time to work alongside the Board of Governors and the senior administration. I have confidence that that Board of Governors will make the right decisions and ensure the future of this university. Thank you.
The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, back in 2010, legislation was passed in this House to require motorists to slow down when passing emergency vehicles stopped on the side of the road. A good bill, Mr. Speaker. However, in order for the law to be effective, Nova Scotians need to know this legislation is in place. So my question to the Minister is, what has the department done to inform Nova Scotians drivers of this new law?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
I thank the member honestly for that question. It's nice to see that I've been included in the process for a change. Important question, and of course that particular bill, because of the good work of the member from Sackville-Cobequid and how proud we were to bring it forth as our first piece of legislation in preparation for the real issue of educating campaigns when it comes to changes in legislation. This was a question that I had brought to the department's attention when we were looking at this important speed limit that's going to be in school zones. I was informed that $50,000 had been spent on the education campaign for this particular piece of legislation. In addition to that, I'm aware of the fact that this, and I'm going to table this, Mr. Speaker, although this young man was a student of mine, I won't hold it up. I would urge that we now have another reprint of this that's going to become available. I will certainly concur with the member opposite. The education campaign is an important issue. It's a piece of legislation that has to be paid close attention to, and I look forward to your suggestions as we proceed.
The honourable member for Clare on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we continue to hear from Nova Scotians that they don't know this law is in place. Mr. Speaker, shortly after this law was enacted, the Chronicle Herald reported that few vehicles were slowing down to 60 kilometers an hour and obeying the law when passing an emergency vehicle stopped on the side of the road. At the time, Mr. Speaker, only 10% of the more than 150 vehicles that passed by RCMP cruisers slowed down to the required speed limit. I will also table a letter, Mr. Speaker, from the Digby Courier dated January 12, 2012, where a resident was fined because he did not know about the change in legislation and expressed his concern.
Order, please. Oral questions put by members to ministers. The time has expired. I will now recognize the House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Love to have heard the answer to that one, too. Can you call private members' public bills for second reading?
Private member public bills for second reading.
Can you call Bill number 27?
Bill number 27, Cyber Bullying Act. I will now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Did you want to go first? Yeah.
Somebody stand up. Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Sorry for the confusion, Mr. Speaker.
That's okay.
I was reluctant to rise until I was sure you were ready for us. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this bill, and I just want to take a few introductory minutes to explain to the House the inspiration for the bill, at least for me personally, by conveying a few facts about the case of Courtney Brown, a young 17-year-old girl in Parsboro who was the victim of pervasive 24/7 both bullying and cyberbullying in her community, the bullying that all too tragically resulted in her taking her own life. Mr. Speaker, Courtney Brown was bullied by a group of young fellow students on the school grounds of Parsboro High School. She was bullied traveling to and from school off of school property. She was bullied at various locations around the town of Parsboro, all by the same people. And even when she was in the supposed safety of her own home, she was cyberbullied continuously in social media, by text message, on Facebook, and so on. Mr. Speaker, I know that there are some who say that the way to avoid cyberbullying is to simply turn off your cell phone or turn off your laptop. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, for young Nova Scotians today, particularly teenage Nova Scotians, there is a whole conversation with their fellow students that goes on electronically that you are then telling them to no longer be a part of, which is a great unfairness to the victims of cyberbullying. The lessons from the story of Courtney Brown, Mr. Speaker, are that it takes everybody in a community to protect our children from bullying and cyberbullying. It takes school officials. It takes the community itself. It takes the parents of cyberbullies. It takes the police, and it takes our court system all working together to protect children today. A far different situation from the bullying that we all remember when we were in school. And it is for that reason, Mr. Speaker, that this bill is part of a comprehensive set of bills, including the Safer Schools Act, including the Stand Up Against Bullying Day Act and the Cyberbullying Intervention Act, all working together to ensure that every member of a community, every adult Nova Scotian, knows their role and responsibility in keeping our children safe from modern bullying which is pervasive, which is nonstop, which exists 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is physical in nature on our school grounds and in our towns and cities and villages and communities and on the internet. Mr. Speaker, that is why we are talking today about this bill, and Courtney Brown's lesson is one that all Nova Scotians would be well to learn, including the members of the government party, and I will say for all parties here in this House. Specifically, Mr. Speaker, in the case of this bill, it does a number of things that we believe are very important to tackle the difficult and pervasive problem of cyberbullying. First of all, we have all heard some Nova Scotians argue that there is no need for stronger bullying legislation because the criminal code and other legislation already deals with things like assault and battery and threats and so on. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that the current set of law is not sufficient to protect our young people today from cyberbullying. And that is why this bill defines cyberbullying in law and makes it an offense in law to commit cyberbullying. This, by the way, is one of the recommendations of the Anti-Bullying Task Force, Mr. Speaker. It further provides for real penalties in the event that a person is found guilty of cyberbullying. Mr. Speaker, it gives real teeth to the law to allow the courts to not only find guilt for cyberbullying specifically, but to impose real penalties. Mr. Speaker, I know that legislators are sometimes reluctant to make criminals of our young people, but a bully is a bully. Whether they're a cyberbully or a physical bully, a bully is a bully, and the effects of their action, as we learned in the case of Courtney Brown, as we know from too many other examples, the effects of their actions today can be deadly. And so the least we can do is define cyberbullying in law, make it an offense, provide for appropriate penalties so that the courts can do what they can to react to incidents of cyberbullying. But Mr. Speaker, in the interest of looking at alternative ways of dealing with cyberbullies when there is a hope of restitution, when we can save a child who is a bully from the courts otherwise, the bill also provides discretion for judges in providing for alternative means of restitution, like education, like getting them the health services that they need, like ensuring that they understand the consequences of their actions, giving them a chance at retribution. That is what the bill also provides, Mr. Speaker, in the interest of getting kids the help they need no matter who they are. But first and foremost, define cyberbullying in law, make it an offense, provide for real penalties, protect our kids from cyberbullying. I might also add, Mr. Speaker, that in order to deal with cyberbullying, we cannot only provide for penalties and restitution after the fact. We have to do all we can to prevent it in the first place, in law. That is why this bill empowers judges to impose a court order where they believe the public safety is at risk, to restrict the use of an electronic device, a laptop, a cell phone, a smartphone, any electronic device that, in the judge's opinion, is being used or could be used for cyberbullying. When the consequences of cyberbullying can be deadly, prevention is the most important thing that we can do. And by allowing any citizen to make application to the courts to have a mobile device restricted or confiscated as a preventative measure is an important step forward in the prevention of cyberbullying in the first place. Now, Mr. Speaker, some members may disagree on one other aspect of the bill that I wanted to raise, but let me be clear, I believe with all my heart, as I know many other Nova Scotians do, that prevention of cyberbullying also involves some responsibility on the part of parents of bullies. Clearly, a parent cannot be expected to stand over the shoulder of their child 24 hours a day when they're on a cell phone or on a laptop. But when a parent knows that their child is engaged in cyberbullying and chooses to do nothing about it, when a parent ought to know that their child is cyberbullying and chooses to do nothing about it, then that parent has failed in their duty not only to their own child, to teach that child responsible use of electronic devices, but they've also failed in their responsibility to protect all of our children from the pervasive and deadly effects of cyberbullying. And so to protect children and to ensure that parents take up their appropriate parental responsibilities, when they are found to have known and not acted, in light of the consequences of that inaction, the bill also makes parents offenders when they turn a blind eye to cyberbullying in the case of their own children. That, Madam Speaker, ensures that the community, the police, school officials, children themselves, and parents of cyberbullies are all doing their role. And so, Madam Speaker, to wind up, I just want to point out that this bill is intended to be a practical, meaningful, nonpartisan way forward. Following on the Anti-Bullying Task Force report, which also identified parents of bullies as part of the puzzle, among other recommendations. Following up on legislation in other provinces like Ontario that are doing their bit to protect our kids from cyberbullies. I know that other members from other parties are going to get up in this House in a moment and they're going to speak generally about how bullying is a bad thing. But I would ask, in the interest of our children, that each member that speaks to this bill today actually say yes or no whether they support this particular bill so that good things can happen to protect our children. Thank you.
Now recognize the honourable member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm certainly glad to stand in my place today to talk about this this bill and in particular this very important topic that we have within our society today, not only in society but also more importantly a lot of it that is happening in our school system. We all know that this issue of bullying is a very serious issue, and that is exactly why the Minister of Education appointed the Cyberbullying and Bullying Task Force to study the issue, to take a look at the kind of causes and effects that we have, some solutions that could arise from the task force and the working group to come forward with some real concrete steps and concrete solutions to move forward with this important subject. And this is, as I said, this is a topic that's a very serious problem in our Nova Scotia schools and in our communities. The thing is that it doesn't just happen in our schools. It happens on the sports field and maybe out in the arts class, maybe at different community groups. This is where this information and this topic and this issue is being that we're seeing. And it causes very harm effects to our children and our youth of this province. And so, you know, I remember being so long ago being on the playground myself, only about 15 years ago, I guess, or so. Seems like months ago. But I remember being there, and back then, of course, we were seeing bullying, of course. Everybody, I think, saw bullying take place in the public school system, and even now as adults, sometimes we see bullies. But, you know, we also, so when I was back in the day, during that time, we didn't see this new aspect of bullying, which plays not only a physical, but also a mental impact in children's lives, and that is through the cyber devices. So things like cell phones, iPads, iPhones, through the internet, through Facebook, Twitter, and all the different social media avenues that we have now at our fingertips. And it's so much easier for us as individuals just to send off an email or send off a text to a friend or because you know, it's just right at our fingertips. And oftentimes what's happening is we're finding that our young people aren't even talking to each other anymore. I remember my wife and I lead a youth group at our church, and we have about 20 high school students who come to our youth group. And I remember one day, one of the kids said, you know, did you know that you can actually send a voice text to your friend? And I said, okay, so how does that work? Well, you just record the message, and then you punch in the phone number you want to send it to, and they'll get the voice text. And I said, you mean like a telephone? Most of the kids these days don't even talk to their friends on the telephone anymore. And these are the types of things that we're seeing change. And Madam Speaker, I can't even imagine. I mean, I'm a new father. I cannot even imagine what technologies are going to be in place by the time my little one goes to school. So, you know, think of even 5 years ago how much things have changed. I mean, many of us have playbooks and iPads and iPhones and Blackberries. And I know the Minister of Transportation may not. He still uses his flip phone. I don't even think the Minister of Transportation knows how to turn on a computer yet, does he? Or anyways. In fact, you know, this is not a perfect world, and in a perfect world, you know, Madam Speaker, we would have no bullying and we would have no cyberbullying. No one deserves to be victim to anything like this, any sort of intimidation at school or at sports or in a community event or even on Facebook. It's a societal problem that each and every person who lives in Nova Scotia has a role to play. I remember I was glad to be part of actually the task force, and one of the things that we were able to find was that I think one of the things is we need to work together as a community. And when I say community, I'm talking students, I'm talking parents, administrators in the school system, teachers, and people who may not even have a role within the school system as community members. All play a role in how we take this response as a societal response so that our children and our young adults are no longer victimized. It requires us all to come together as partners who are committed to putting an end to something that is really an unacceptable behavior. And while it is encouraging to know that all members of this House view this as a major problem, which I genuinely do, I genuinely believe that everybody on both sides of this House believe that this is a major problem that needs to be addressed. And that's why our government knows that it's not about just taking a knee-jerk reaction with a number of one-off pieces of legislation. This is a whole piece. This is just a beginning of a good thing that's going to be moving forward. This is about working together to change the culture that has festered for far too long. It's about developing a well-thought-out and comprehensive plan, and that's exactly what we're going to do. And that is why our government took the action to deal with the issue of establishing a task force on cyberbullying and bullying. You know, I had the great pleasure of working with the task force during their work, and there are some, as we saw today, we saw some people, we saw some of the working group folks who were here. They were dedicated, they were volunteers, quite frankly, on this working group, and they came from people from Kids Health Phone to Bell Alliant to pretty much everybody who you would think should be sitting at the table was there. And they were meeting 2 or 3 days in every month to discuss these. We're talking about law enforcement people as well, who we discussed this issue at a table, and so many different thoughts and ideas were being presented. We often said, you know, for the chair of the task force to come together and really try to piece all of those things together. I mean, I can't imagine how difficult that was. But one of the things I do remember is being down in Yarmouth when we were on the road, and down in Yarmouth, it was a pilot project, and the pilot project through the restorative justice program. I remember being at the high school, and in fact, one of the students said, they call it RJ, right? They call it RJ for short, restorative justice. They saw it as such a positive thing. In fact, they saw that students and teachers and administration actually saw their rates of absences for teachers going down. We saw the absent rate of students going down because they didn't feel threatened, and it actually created a more of a positive atmosphere at the school. So I remember going into the school, and I mean, sometimes, it depends on the school, depends on the area, or the different community that we may represent. But sometimes when you go into a high school, you may just kind of walk into the office and nobody greets you. But they had no idea who I was. They had no idea who the other couple of people that were there with me. And they literally came up out of the blue. It wasn't staged. They came up to me and said, "Hey, welcome to Yarmouth High." I mean, I know that's something small, but all those small things kind of that piece together really do play an important role in how we're going to do this together. Now, I know the opposition, the Progressive Conservative Party, I know sometimes, and the Conservative Party of Canada, I know they like to do very punitive things. They like to go through things that will actually punish people. And one of the things I came across when thinking about, I know they talk about doing penalties. Now, one of the things that they suggested in the 2009 provincial election document, they actually said that they would introduce legislation to put in place a public curfew for kids under the age of 16 who are not accompanied by an adult. Now, I'm going to table that document. And this is the type of punitive response that the Conservative Party would try to do. And quite frankly, we just don't think that that's the right approach. We have to ensure, we have to look at the...
Order, please. Recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Member who has the floor not speak to what the Conservative Party might or might not do, but he is speaking about something that has absolutely nothing to do with this bill, which is a violation of the rules of the House.
I recognize the Honourable Member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
So, Madam Speaker, can I go until 4:52 then?
Carry on.
Thank you. So anyways, I do want to know that, I'm glad that our government is taking action on this. You'll see over the next couple of days and weeks ahead that we will be moving forward on this. An act, of course, today we saw our act being brought forward, and we all have a role to play in this, Madam Speaker. We know that we have a role to play in helping to keep our children safe. And as a government, we are taking the responsible approach through the legislation we introduced today, which will help provide the foundation for a strong and an effective action plan. And thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to speak a few words on Bill number 27, the Cyberbullying Act. And first I want to take the opportunity to commend, I do believe it's the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party who sponsored the bill. Madam Speaker, as opposition parties, and the government would know this as they spent their entire existence in opposition prior to the last election, that no government has a monopoly or has ownership over good ideas, or ideas, whether we think they're good or not, that should at least be debated by Nova Scotians, or at least put in front of them for their consideration. One of the challenges with the British parliamentary system is that we are granted 4 hours a week, opposition day on Wednesday, in order to bring forward issues of concern for the opposition parties. So what usually happens is that the government will have ministerial statements, 1 or 2. We had 2 today, but that's been the standard, 1 to 2 every opposition day. All of the ministers will get up and read resolutions, and then the backbenchers, who we don't hear a word from during the rest of the week, all have resolutions to give on opposition day. Mr. Speaker, this is not the first government to do this. Let me make it clear. This is an old trick that's been done by previous governments as well. But it's unfortunate that, having seen what what it was like when they were in opposition, that they would turn around and do the very same thing when they are in government, which leaves the opposition little to no time in order to debate legislation that is brought forward. And so the question Nova Scotians should be asking themselves, those who might be following today, is what happens to this bill? Well, here's what happens. Because it's an opposition bill that's been called by the opposition on their opposition day, is that there's a set amount of time for debate on this bill. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that the government will ensure, through its members, mostly the backbenchers, that whatever allotted time there is, they will continue to speak beyond that time, meaning that this bill will never come to a vote. Meaning that it'll never go to Law Amendments Committee, meaning that it'll never have a chance for Nova Scotians to consider it, to debate it, to express their opinions, and allow the House to make a determination as to whether it should go on for third reading, committee of the whole House. That is the frustration of the British parliamentary system, because we're basically at the mercy of the government House leader to determine what opposition bills might get called and supported by the government. Madam Speaker, you know, this goes to the whole process of the bill itself, which I know the Minister of Service Nova Scotia is well aware, having sat on the opposition benches for a significant period of time. And that's the unfortunate thing, Madam Speaker, because under minority government, I have to say, we saw a number of opposition bills get passed. And I stand before you to say I'm very proud of the fact that in opposition, I had 11 private members' bills passed into law in the province of Nova Scotia.
Order, please. I would just remind the member to find a way, I guess, to bring this back to the bill that's before us, Bill 27, the Cyberbullying Act, versus the process of the House of Assembly. I recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Well, Madam Speaker, in order for Bill 27 to have any hopes of going forward, I think it's important that the members understand exactly how it would go about and what it is that we're doing here today and whether it has any realistic chance of being able to succeed. And only time will tell. Maybe the government will allow this to come to a vote today, and there's another piece of legislation as well. Madam Speaker, I'd like to talk about the topic. I'm glad you brought me back to that, because I have to say, Madam Speaker, that it was extremely unfortunate. You've heard me in the past talk about how the government, in their speech from the throne, I thought it was extremely disrespectful that there were political motivated comments in there that the Lieutenant Governor was asked to read. And now today, we turn around and we hear the Minister of Education, in introducing this legislation and in making her statement, take cheap political shots regarding the previous Minister of Education. Now, Mr. Speaker, when politics is politics, let's all understand that. But when you're talking about an issue such as cyberbullying, and you're talking about the fact that lives have been lost, and for a Minister of Education to say she takes the matter seriously and turn around and take cheap political shots at her opponents, Madam Speaker, it was extremely distasteful. I would have hoped the Minister of Education would have taken the opportunity to retract her comments and even to apologize to the House and to Nova Scotians and to all students for having chosen the issue of cyberbullying as a chance to score some sort of cheap political points. But that is a pattern that we have come to see from this government. And again, I think it takes away from the argument that's trying to be addressed here. Madam Speaker, I had the opportunity to attend the Take Your MLA to School Day. And while I was there, I noticed that a few of the children had badges on them. They looked like these little badges that you would almost see from play sets that kids would have. And I didn't really at the time understand what the badges were until suddenly in the middle of school day, the vice principal walked in, Mrs. Tanya Carter, and she said, I'm going to now swear in Mr. Sampson as an officer of the WITS program, W-I-T-S. And it's an anti-bullying program, and for the life of me, I can't remember what the exact acronyms stand for. One, I think, is walk away. I think another one is inform someone. It stands for an actual program. This is a program that was developed with the local RCMP. It was developed with the school. It was sponsored by a number of the Lions Club and I believe a number of other agencies. And this was something that the kids wore with pride. And I actually got sworn in. I was given my badge, and had I known this debate was coming forward today, I would have brought it here in the House. It may have been considered a prop, but just the same, I think it would have been a good example of showing the work that's already taking place within our school system to try to address this very disturbing issue that has come up with the advent of technology. And I do want to commend the member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville, because he spoke freely, which is refreshing. I notice he doesn't have a stand on his desk, and nor did he read from prepared notes, which we've seen so many other government backbenchers do when it's come to Opposition Day, because I think he has an interest in this subject. He spoke about it with passion. He spoke about it with because he sat on this task force, and I commend him for that. And I certainly think when you see a member who's able to stand in their place without notes, I think they come off as being much more sincere than those who sit with notes that are prepared by a staff person back in their own office. So I do want to commend him, and I think he mentioned it was about 15 years since he was on the playground. I think I'm a lot closer to him than many of the other members in the House, but probably a few years off, but much closer to him, I would say, than many of the other members in this House can stand and say. Madam Speaker, we do have some concerns about the intent of the bill in placing parental liability. That is concerns we have had in the past, having been a member of this House for 14 years. I do remember the Blue Book that was brought in by former Premier John Hamm, and there was some provisions in there to hold parents liable for the actions of their children on other matters. We disagreed then. I still have reservations today, but I will stand in my place and commend them for at least putting the issue forward, and at least having a discussion on it, and at least allowing Nova Scotians to see that the members of the opposition are trying to bring forward ideas of a problem which is facing Nova Scotians. And I think that's how our democracy works, and I think that's the strength of our democracy in Nova Scotia, that we can at least do that freely as members of the House. Now, again, as I mentioned before, the restraints of the British parliamentary system make it extremely difficult for this bill to move anywhere further, which one would hope that with parliamentary reform that we've talked about, there may be opportunities there for more private members' bills to be able to come forward and at least make it to the second reading stage, possibly law amendments where Nova Scotians can come forward, discuss what their concerns or support is, and that as a legislature we can then make a decision as to whether these bills should go forward or not. And only time will tell whether this administration has any interest in making those changes. And again, because of the British parliamentary system, the opposition can't make them on their own. We don't have the numbers. It is a majority government. It will take them to bring about that change. But life has become different with technology. And I think my time isn't much longer, but let me just share this story. I think there was some talk earlier about how kids communicate differently this day and age, and one of the gentlemen who plays hockey with me in the Richmond Gentlemen's Hockey League was telling us the story of how his son asked a girl to be his date at the prom. And he told his father who he was considering asking, and his father said, that's a very nice girl, and you should call her and everything else. And he said, no, I'm not going to bother. And he said, well, how are you going? Are you going to ask her at school? You know, how are you going to do it? He said, no, I won't talk to her at school, and I don't have to call her. And the father said, well, how are you going to communicate to her that you would like her to be your date at the prom if you're not going to have any sort of discussions with her? Are you going to use a third party, or how are you going to do this? Are you going to write her a note? And he looked at his father and said, Dad, I sent her a text. I asked her to be my date at the prom, and she texted back and said, no problem. In fact, if I had to guess, she probably just wrote NP on her reply of the text and not actually those words. There's a whole new language out there, Madam Speaker, that we're learning. I think all members are learning the acronyms that go along with texting. But it is an issue that does require some discussion. And cyberbullying is one thing when you can identify who the bully is. It's another issue when there's anonymity in that process. And that's certainly something I think we need to address, whether we're looking at those who post comments on media sites without identifying themselves or other forms of media. I think that's issues that we need to address, and certainly anything we can do to address this problem, we should all be working towards. And again, I commend the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party for bringing this issue to the floor of the House today. Merci.
Thank you. Now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I guess when we look at, in this legislature, if we look at initiatives designed to reduce bullying, we must make sure that we ourselves don't get into a fight. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that we set an example. Madam Speaker, I think it's important that we set an example and continue and have these debates with a respectful tone. And I do appreciate the comments of the member for Richmond and the support shown towards this legislation. We would have liked to hear a similar response by the member for the party opposite. I guess, Madam Speaker, the aim of this legislation is to give the justice system some ability to do something to stop cyberbullying. And I guess, how did we used to handle bullying? Well, I can remember a story my father told me about himself many years ago on the playground. I think it was at recess time, and I guess he had been being bullied many times for this one other young fellow, and he handled it by delivering a right cross square to the jaw. And while I wouldn't necessarily advocate that, Madam Speaker, I know in the old days there wasn't a lot of sophistication around these matters, and maybe there didn't require to be as much sophistication. You had to stick up for yourself, and children would try to do that. But I guess what I want to speak about a little bit today is that some children have less ability to do that than others. Certainly, I suppose you could look at it physically. Some children are naturally bigger than others, and they can stand up for themselves in that regard. But I'd like to speak more about confidence and how confidence relates to people's ability to withstand the bullying. And in this case, of course, we're talking today, Madam Speaker, about cyberbullying. And I know that when people are confident, their recovery time, when they feel the barbs of the insults, the recovery time is much quicker when one is confident. And I know that many young people do not have, growing up, they do not grow up with the supports to be confident. They may not have the ability to have the most fashionable clothes, for instance, Madam Speaker. They might grow up without the ability to participate in sport or artistic activities that other children may have the ability to participate in, and thus become ostracized from their peers. We know that young people, in some cases, may not have the emotional support at home. And all these things lead to people's ability to have confidence in themselves. And I think it's important that we recognize that some young people are growing up in situations where they don't have that, and it's harder for them to stand up to bullies. And I was watching a movie over the weekend, and there was a key line that stuck out to me, and that it was that people who have confidence, or the benefit of confidence, it comes as a result of having success in life. And some young people have difficulty because of the state that they are in, which is no fault of their own. And I think we need to remember that when we are seeing people who are bullied. And a message for young people today, Madam Speaker, be a leader in your own classroom. And if you see a peer who's being treated poorly, stand up for them. And remember that everybody walks through life on a different path, and sometimes it's important to help out your neighbor. So I think, Madam Speaker, that we've talked in here about parents having to take the responsibility for their children. And too often today we have parents who may stand up for a child without knowing the full extent of the situation, and quickly stand up for their child, which may be supporting poor behavior, which could be bullying, and it could be cyberbullying. And I think what's important about this legislation is that we're asking that parents who would have to be warned, of course, in advance, or be aware of the cyberbullying activity, but we would ask that they take some responsibility for their child's behavior. I think that's good for our communities, Madam Speaker. It's good common sense. But it would be considered a defense for a parent to prove that they have exercised due diligence to prevent the child from committing the offense. In other words, if a parent was aware and they were taking steps to ask their child to change their behavior, that could act as a defense for them. We want to be reasonable, Madam Speaker. Technology has given rise to a new problem with bullying because we have it through another medium, and we've heard all members talk about the changes in our world and how people communicate. This legislation is designed in some cases to take that medium away. That is one measure to try to stop this activity. And secondly, and this is very important, Madam Speaker, is that it would allow for alternative measures to be used prior to a plea of guilty. What I'm speaking about here, Madam Speaker, is restorative justice. And our legislation, and I think this is important for all members to hear this, because all members should think about supporting this piece of legislation. This legislation has received some positive comments from Professor Wayne McKay. He was the chair of the Cyberbullying Task Force. And he wanted to register the importance of restorative justice. And I would like to assure him today, and this legislature today, that restorative justice is a part of this legislation. And that the goal of restoring those specifically affected and the community, using the justice system to bring things back into balance, and using alternative measures, which would be restorative justice, to steer a young person in the right direction so they truly understand is where we expect most cases will go. And we did it. We came up with this legislation with the advice of the task force in mind. So, Madam Speaker, what I'm speaking about here is atonement, giving young people who very well may have been bullied themselves, which has taught them to feel whatever they feel when they decide to bully someone else. To recognize that there should be an opportunity for them to make atonement and to understand what they've done, and to understand if they've been bullied that what was done to them wasn't right either. But their response to it, it should not be to continue the behavior and do it to someone else, but to actually stop the behavior right there in its tracks. We also must recognize, as we have in this legislation, that there may need to be a restoration of the community in which both the bully and the person who has been bullied reside, whether that's in a physical, geographic community, or whether it's on say, an internet community, which could be, of course, a community of people from a large geographic region. So, Madam Speaker, once this legislation is passed, we could look at regulations which would more specifically define the alternative measures for restorative justice. So, Madam Speaker, I guess just to close, I think it's important that members in the legislature take a stand on this piece of legislation. And we believe, is why we put it forward, that it is something that will be helpful. So with that, Madam Speaker, I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you.
I recognize the honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I know the member for Richmond talked about, when he was discussing Bill 27, he talked about the talking out of time in relationship to opposition bills. And I guess, Madam Speaker, that's what I may be doing at this time. But we, as a government, our Minister of Education, has in fact introduced a very comprehensive bill. And that bill will be dealt with in this House. And it's not a piecemealing. It is an entire package that we are dealing with. And the minister has a real handle on this situation, and I think that we will see some very good results from that. Now, very recently, I was talking to some young people, and this cyberbullying, I mean, someone talked, I think it was the minister or the member for Hammonds Plains, Sackville Hammonds Plains, who talked about being in the upper Sackville Hammonds Plains. I know it well. The member was talking about being in the playground in relationship to very recent times. And I guess I have to reflect back to having to go to a neighbor's house to use even a telephone. But I was talking to some young people talking to some young people recently, and this is a very serious problem. The young girls that I was talking with recently, they were texting each other, and one was calling the other ugly, and the other was saying double ugly, and they were saying they were doing this affectionately. Well, I think, you know, if you are called double ugly repeatedly, cyberbullying is really something that we have to deal with. Thank you very much.
I recognize the House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. Could you call Bill number 29, the Child Protection Intervention Act?
I call Bill number 29, the Child Protection Intervention Act. Recognize the honourable member for Victoria, the Lakes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in my place to speak to Bill 29, the Child Protection Intervention Act, an act to protect children from those who might harm them. And Madam Speaker, before I begin, for the benefit of the member from Richmond, I do have prepared notes, but I wrote them myself. So, Madam Speaker, this bill puts protection of a child or children above all else. Protection of children must be paramount. Madam Speaker, ask any parent. This bill actually does put the protection of the child or children first, not second or third, Madam Speaker, first. Instead of an imaginary protocol that was used as an excuse not to take action in situations like in the East Preston daycare that we've been hearing over the past few weeks. This is part of a new way. Madam Speaker, as everyone is aware over the discussion that has taken place concerning the East Preston daycare, let me just expand on the events that unfolded and how this bill would certainly improve that situation. Madam Speaker, we are aware that at the East Preston daycare, there was an alleged abuser employed there. And when it became known to the department contacted the police to do an investigation. Now, we also are very much aware, Madam Speaker, that although the police were notified, the Board of Directors of East Preston Daycare were not notified. Parents were not aware that this individual, this alleged abuser, was working at the daycare and that their children could be in danger. What this bill does, Madam Speaker, it allows a judge of a Supreme Court to order that someone have no contact with children, not hold a certain type of job, not go to certain locations, and not undertake activities that relate to children. Now, Madam Speaker, that order would only happen after a fair hearing and only if there are reasonable grounds to believe that any child or children need protection. So in the case, once more, of East Preston Daycare, this would have given the minister or the department the opportunity to have an order that would prevent that individual, that alleged abuser, from being anywhere near the children under its care. Madam Speaker, there could be an order made if there's a physical or sexual abuse of a child or children, and there can be an order if there's a substantial risk that a child or children will be sexually abused or otherwise physically harmed. And Madam Speaker, it's important to note that substantial risk is if there's a real chance of danger that is apparent on the evidence. So, Madam Speaker, if a court satisfied that there's evidence of a real chance of danger, they can intervene to protect a child. And how that takes place, Madam Speaker, would be that the judge of the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia would empower justices of the peace to grant an interim order. We know, Madam Speaker, that it isn't wise to have someone that is an alleged abuser around children. And now with this bill that we hope will be passed by this legislature, this bill would be an important tool for protecting our most vulnerable citizens. Again, Madam Speaker, it can't be stressed enough. This bill is for the protection of, it puts the protection of the child or a group of children first. Also, Madam Speaker, this bill removes the excuses not to take action in situations like occurred at the East Preston daycare. You know, Madam Speaker, there are times when evidence and the need to act may arise quickly, and there needs to be a way to act to protect a child or children with speed, but without undue prejudice, and this bill does exactly that. As I mentioned before, Madam Speaker, this bill provides for a Chief Judge of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia to designate justices of the peace for the purpose of the Act. Unlike the Department of Community Services interpretation of the Child and Family Services Act, the child or children at risk can be unknown. Sometimes we know there's a risk to children, but it is to any children that encounter that risk. So, Madam Speaker, if there's reason to suspect the possibility of abuse, either physically or sexually, the Department of Justice can go to the presiding Justice of the Peace, present its evidence, and seek an interim court order. And that order, under the bill, Madam Speaker, would be made for a period not exceeding 30 days. But because of the emergency to act before harm is done, there has to be reasonable grounds to suspect that a child or children are really definitely in need of protection. Madam Speaker, this provides the first step, as I mentioned, ensuring that a child or children are protected in the quickest and fairest way possible. Madam Speaker, the cost to the child of suffering abuse is immeasurable, and we all know that. The cost to the child, the cost to the parents. So we need to be cautious. We need to make sure that those children are protected. And if we have any indication by any means at all, we should make sure that there is a law in place that's going to do just that. The law has guarantees of procedural fairness. You know, some might say, well, anybody can just put in a complaint, but we have to realize that justices of the peace and judges will hear the cases, they'll weed out the weaker cases, and a hearing will clear up other matters. So if that initial order is given by a justice of the peace, it goes to the Chief Judge or to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia, and they determine at that point, once they've gotten all the evidence as to whether or not things will proceed. I'm sure, Madam Speaker, had this bill been in place when everything started happening with the East Preston Daycare Centre, regardless of how long we might want to say it's been going on, it would have provided a tool for the department to take immediate action to protect the children. I can't say it enough, Madam Speaker. The bill aim is to put the protection of the child first. And we have to look at this bill seriously because it does just that. It's a small step, but it's an immediate step that can be put into place when things happen. As I mentioned before, we have to act quickly, we have to act have to act decisively, but we also have to act in fairness to the children that are facing a possible or an alleged abuser. But we also have to recognize the person that's being investigated. So, again, Madam Speaker, this bill, as I've mentioned earlier, does put the protection of the child first. And we're going to have opportunity over the next while to hear speakers from both sides of the House comment on this bill, and I look forward to hearing their discussion as the bill progresses. With that, I'll take my seat, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's a real pleasure today, Madam Speaker, to rise today to speak on opposition business, which is Bill 29, the Child Protection Intervention Act. I have to say that I absolutely commend and understand the intent of this bill. All of us feel that it is paramount to protect children from all sorts of harms, not only from the harms which may be deliberately inflicted, but from the varieties of harm which can occur throughout the world. However, I am concerned about this bill. The name of it is, in fact, very revelatory, intervention, and it opens some very worrisome doors. This bill is intended to intervene in the normal legal process. It takes effect on suspicion, and it provides for the appointment of special justices of the peace, not justices, to make orders on a balance of probability, which is to say it's more likely than not that a particular person, a named person, poses a threat to some child, unnamed, or group of children, unnamed. Those orders would be confirmed later after some unspecified period of time to be set by regulations made by a cabinet. And those orders would be confirmed by a judge and only afterwards followed by a hearing. At that hearing, interestingly, a court would not only order a person to stay away from some child or unnamed group of children, but to also order that the hearing be held in private and the files kept private and other details kept secret. We all understand the importance of confidentiality when it comes to the possible revealing of details about minors, but there is as well a concern for the adult. And anyone violating any terms of these orders could be subject, literally, to arrest without warrant. The court would have not only the normal remedies for contempt of court, but also the ability to imprison for up to 90 days and fine for up to $5,000 in addition for any violation of an order. And that's a heavy weapon potentially available to deal with the possibility of talking about a particular court process involving a person who, at the bottom, hasn't been criminally convicted or necessarily even ever criminally investigated. I appreciate the sentiment behind this bill because vulnerable people do need and deserve our protection from immediate harm, whether they are children or adults or seniors. And the safety and security of children is the highest priority for this government and has been throughout. And it has been very, very important for us in the many ways in which we undertake to protect these young and very vulnerable citizens. This government takes all reports of potential child abuse or neglect seriously. And all cases do merit careful consideration. Community Services has the legislative jurisdiction for child protection, although it does not deal with criminal prosecutions. The government can intervene to protect children under the Children and Family Services Act, or the CFSA. In Nova Scotia, this act relates to children and youth under the age of 16, and it gives the department the authority to become involved with reviewing and investigating reports of possible child or abuse or neglect in many settings, whether institutional or private, offering services for families which may need support in protecting, caring for their children, making alternative arrangements for children who need protection, arranging for adoption services, and supporting youth leaving foster care. These are all responsibilities which the Department of Community Services takes very seriously. And there is a mechanism with the Children and Family Services Act that allows the department to take action with respect to identified children in identifiable need of protection. This bill, however, allows for the granting of a protective intervention order. There is a criminal process to be followed in cases of alleged abuse of children. This happens in the absence of allegations. The potential exists that members of the public could, in fact, request the application for intervention in cases where it's not appropriate. Let me speak plainly. In practical terms, this proposed bill intends that a person who may or may not have been alleged to commit an act of abuse or be suspected of being dangerous to children in general with no reference to any particular child. The Justice Minister could then file an application with a Justice of the Peace for a restraining order on that individual. And certain aspects of that really do seem to violate a person's constitutional rights and don't support a fair legal process. I should note as well the absence of any appeal provision after a hearing by the Supreme Court. That is an unusual absence in any piece of legislation in this province. I know that there has been a conversation about a particular case on a related topic, which may perhaps be the impetus behind this bill, that has been raised in this House, and that's in regards to the East Preston daycare. An allegation has been made against former staff members of the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. Among those people was someone who has, for the past, I believe, 10 years, been an employee of the East Preston daycare, who presumably received that person's resume at the time they engaged him. However, when these allegations were made against the former employees of the Home for Coloured Children, it was referred to the Department of Community Services on the 15th of November, 2012. Community Services acted on the same day. And as required, they checked the child abuse registry. They checked internal departmental records, and they checked with police. And they found absolutely no evidence of criminal conviction or investigation. 2000, okay. If there had been any evidence that a child was currently at risk, Community Services has the ability and could have launched a joint investigation with police. There was, however, no evidence of future danger. The talk of emergency surprises me when we are speaking of something which may or may not have happened 10 years ago, and which is still not even worthy of investigation, it appears. Section 25 of the Child and Family Services Act provides government with the authority to investigate a direct complaint that a child currently under the age of 16 may be in need of protection at this time. Again, none was found. The Department of Community Services does not investigate and cannot investigate allegations of past criminal activity. That is a matter for the police. Community Services acted immediately to check for evidence that a child currently needed protection against possible future harm, and in the absence of any criminal charges, let alone convictions, no evidence was found in the case of the employee of the East Preston daycare. The government acted within its authority and is following up appropriately. To return to Bill 29, the notion of protecting children is laudable. All of us want children safe from all varieties of harm, physical and emotional. This government certainly welcomes feedback and is always welcoming suggestions on how existing legislation could be made better. But I believe it is very, very important that we must also respect the fact that we have an independent judicial system, that we have a Department of Justice, we have a police service, and that it is not our role to short-circuit or to facilitate the short-circuiting of the judicial system on which all of us rely, adults and children alike. These children will grow up to become adults who will also want to rely on the safety and security of an intact judicial system, and one which is not subject to sudden and unpredictable torques which are redundant in the face of an existing system. Again, the Department of Community Services is tasked with the protection of children, and it does its work well, and it looks to the protection of children against future harm, which is potential. But it is not in the business of investigating past criminal allegations or of substituting its judgment for that of the court. I worry, therefore, that this bill may be opening doors which will be very difficult ever to close again in the lives of children and adults alike. And with that, Madam Speaker, I will take my seat.
Recognize the Honourable Member for Halifax, Clayton Park.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. It's my privilege to speak to this bill. It was just introduced yesterday and has been called for the opposition day today by the Conservative Party. The bill is called the Child Protection Intervention Act, and it has a subtitle, An Act to Protect Children from Those Who Might Harm Them. And I think based on that title, none of us would have any objection at all. Of course, we think children are precious and we want to protect them from all harm. I think, you know, we all have young people who are special in our lives that we can relate this to, and we don't want to see them come to any harm. But as is our job here in the legislature, we have to go through bills and we have to look and anticipate what might be the repercussions of moving forward with any particular piece of legislation. And it's been my experience, Madam Speaker, that there's always things that you may not have anticipated when you set out to address a certain problem, and you might craft a solution. You might put it into the form of a bill and bring it here, either as a government bill or a private member's bill. And it can be a real surprise sometimes to go to law amendments and have people come in, members of the public, who will then point out, well, if you do this, something else is going to happen that we didn't anticipate and that we can see would be a bad outcome. And often we make changes in legislation after the law amendments process, perhaps not as often as we should, but we do listen to the people who come in, and I have seen positive change come because the people that are most closely affected will see where there can be problems. And in this case of reading Bill 29 today and preparing to speak for my allotted time, a lot of questions came to mind. And first of all, this it has a lot of legal implications. And I know the previous speaker, the member for Halifax Atlantic, is a lawyer by training. I believe she has a law degree. That means she spent some time on it. I do not have a law degree, although I took business law once, and that doesn't quite cover what we're talking about here. But you know, in reading it, I'm thinking of some of the things as well that I've seen and heard as an MLA in the last 9 years, and the experience that I've had there that I think has some bearing in what we might see as some very heavy-handed legislation. You know, I hesitate to be critical of it because I think that the intent of it is very positive. The intent is to try and step in early before harm is done or immediately upon hearing of any harm to a child. And I noticed that children are identified as 16 and under, I think. Under the age of 16, so it would be up to 15 that we're talking about here, and those sort of things are important when you're crafting legislation. But this gives some really extraordinary powers to a number of new sort of structure we'd be putting in place. We'd have new justices of the peace that would be given, I suppose, some training in how to look at the issues and to be able to this new crop of justices of the peace would be given the power to offer, I guess, I'm not sure what it's called exactly, but to actually step in and put sort of restraining orders on people, essentially. So if there was any allegation or anything that they thought looked probable, they could then harm somebody by taking those allegations and saying that they were now prohibited from being near these children, named or unnamed, and that would stand for 30 days, and then the Justice of the Peace would have to have written down what evidence they had or what they were basing their decision on, send that to a court, and a judge would then decide, if I'm following this correctly, a judge would then look at that within the 30 days and decide whether there were grounds to bring it to the courts, or there were not, or it needed to be amended in some way. So they could either terminate that injunction against the person or add some more what would we call it exactly? I guess conditions to that order, And they could also terminate it, just say there isn't grounds here at all. So if they're moving forward with the order, the evidence has to come before a court, so you're creating more work in the court as well, that these cases, if there is some reasonable grounds, and I guess if it's past the judge's test, it's gone past the justice of the peace and on to a judge, and the staff there have looked at the case. If there are reasonable grounds, then you're going to have a hearing in the courts, and the respondent, who is actually, I've put down the alleged abuser or the alleged wrongdoer, that is going to be called the respondent would be asked to come and make their case, I guess, and defend themselves. My fear is that it's created a whole secondary system within our courts. It gives extraordinary powers to people. As I say, it allows somebody on what could be very flimsy information to cause harm to somebody. And I noticed that Clause 10 in the bill says no action or other proceeding may be instituted against any person for any act done in good faith or any alleged neglect or default in good faith in the execution or intended execution of the person's duty under this act. So that means if you've moved falsely against somebody and you have harmed them, you have harmed their reputation, or you've harmed them, you know, in a very substantial way, if they had been acted upon, if they had been told that there was an injunction against them, or they weren't allowed to be with children, or to pursue even their work that might involve children. If you've harmed them, you've taken away from that person the right to in any way sue you for wronging them. That's another big thing. You couldn't say that this was done improperly. As long as the justice of the peace and the judge and everybody else involved in this process believe they were acting in good faith, then they are, I guess, you know, able to be sort of above the law in a sense, because they cannot be charged in any way in another court of law where a person could come and say, you have wronged me very seriously. So we're protecting the people that are involved in this process, because I guess it's anticipated that there would be mistakes made and that some people would be harmed. I wanted to speak a little bit about some of the things that I've seen as an MLA, and what I have seen in a number of cases have been cases that involved protective services for children, where there again have been perhaps an incident at school or in the neighborhood where complaints have come to community services saying that somebody is fearful that a child might be harmed. And when that happens, my experience is community services through the Child Protection Agency goes into gear pretty fast. In fact, some of the cases that I've had are parents, or often single parents, who are feeling that they've done nothing, and it's been based on an allegation that the children are taken from them. And you know, there can be a lot of reasons. It might be that they are perhaps they don't have enough money, so they don't have childcare as often as they should. So there's some really extenuating issues around poverty that can be at the root of it. But the parents have to work so hard to get their children back. It is, if you've been charged, it's not in a legal sense, but if your children have been taken from you because there's a fear that you're not treating them properly or that they're at risk, it's very difficult to go through that whole system and have your children returned to you. I'm sure we've all been through that with grandparents or parents, and there are mistakes made, definitely. But I understand Protective Services acts in the best interest of the child. They are frightened and they're trying to take preemptive action. So we have to understand that, you know, for every mistake that's made, there's probably many that are proper, and the children did need protection. So I'm just wondering how this bill would fit into that scenario where we already have something in place to protect children. We already, I think, have considered that children need protection. You know, by the same token, there's another case that has come up. I think I only have a couple of minutes left in my time. I have till 5:47, according to me. You don't think so? 5:47 was the time I was given, Mr. Speaker.
The time that I have is 5:45, if I'm reading my correct. Okay. There was a change, apparently.
Okay, I didn't see that.
Sorry.
Well, I'd like to mention about another thing, and that is protecting adults as well. I had a case, and the members of the House know I've spoken quite a bit about victim services. The case that I learned about this was a murder case in my riding, and it didn't occur in my riding, but the parent lived in my riding, the parent of the victim. And in this case, the man who committed the murder had many charges against him previously, was known to the police, but there had never been a conviction. And he was working in a work environment where, in fact, with the elderly, so you would think that he was somebody you could trust. And that was where the victim had met him, was at her workplace. You would think you could trust somebody you meet at your workplace. What was said by the parent is, if there are all these charges against them, why can't you find that out when you check against a registry of criminal registry to see that that person was a wrongdoer? But because no woman in the past had the courage to stay with those charges and go through the court system and see that person charged and convicted, that person didn't have a record. And I think it's a similar thing to what the opposition Conservatives are talking about today, trying to preempt that system to say, well, even if there's a suspicion, and there would have been a suspicion in this case, which is an adult case, but the courts and the way our judicial system is that you're innocent until proven guilty. And I found it hard to grapple with that on that level of adults and in the employer system. The employer didn't know, and the employer had done their due diligence and checked records and couldn't find anything. So they didn't know they had somebody that had charges against them. This system, this parallel system that the bill purports to set up, I think would be costly. I think it circumvents a lot of the rights that we have built into our judicial system. And I think its point is to support and protect children, and I think that is very good, but I think there would have to be some changes made to make it work better than what is outlined in this bill as it is today. But should it go forward, I think we'd hear a lot from people, civil rights people that would talk about the law, and I would learn a lot, I'm sure, and perhaps it's a bill that could be amended and changed so that it could go forward. But those are the concerns I have with it. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. The Honourable, the member for Cape Breton North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in my place today to speak of the Bill number 29, an act to protect our children from those who might harm them. Mr. Speaker, when I look at this bill and I hear what's being talked about in this House today, I hear the confidentiality, breaching confidentiality. I understand that part of bill, but we have to think as well of the cost of a child suffering abuse that is immeasurable. I have to look back at the protection of a gentleman like Mr. Graham James, who's been accused of child molestation as being a coach of a hockey team on a young gentleman by the name of Theo Fleury. And when I look back at this case, and I read the book that Mr. Fleury has written, the problems he suffered at the hands of a gentleman like Mr. Graham James, a now convicted child molester, and the problems that this gentleman has had to deal with in his lifetime, especially in early adulthood and into his adulthood. The way that it affected his life and how he had to struggle with addictions, how he had to put his life back in order, how he struggled with relationships, and how it's affected him physically and mentally and financially. The gentleman struggled with problems of alcoholism. He struggled with problems of trust. We can't allow this to happen to our children, Mr. Speaker. Most of us here have our own children, and the intent of the bill is to protect our children from those who are out there who take advantage of children who can't protect themselves. In light of what we've seen over the last couple of weeks and number of years, this bill comes at a good time. It's a good bill, and it's been being introduced when awareness is at a height in this province. We need to do all we can to protect the most vulnerable in our society, that being our children. And as we define in the bill, our children are people who are under the age of 16. But we're talking young children as well, people in daycares, people who participate in sporting events, people who frequent shopping malls, people who frequent baseball fields, skateboard parks. Some of these people, Mr. Speaker, cannot protect themselves. Some of them can't speak for themselves. And we're attempting to do a little bit of speaking for these children. Our children are the people who will grow up and replace us even here, to look after us as we get old. And we need to get this right. I know myself, I'm hoping that when our children get older and they start looking after us, that we'll be able to count on them not to have any demons, so-called demons in their closet that may affect their ability to look after us and to be productive members of society. The bill removes excuses not to take action in a situation like the East Preston daycare, where we hear the protocol was followed, but it seemed like it protected the accused and not the children or the family of the children involved. And it protected the people out there who may do harm to them. Mr. Speaker, we would not stand by at a sporting event or a public place and watch another person take advantage of our children, be it another child or an adult. So we don't want to allow this to happen in places like the East Preston daycare. Instead of an imaginary protocol, this will be part of a new way, putting the protection of children first, not second or third, and not shunted aside by excuses. This act allows a judge of the Supreme Court to order someone to have no contact with children, not to hold a certain type of job, not to go to any location or undertake any activity that relates to our children. We have concern about these type of individuals being in places like rinks and ball fields and playgrounds and daycares, because children sometimes can be scared and they're not saying something. And all we need is an order to help protect these children. The order will be put in after a fair hearing. And let's be clear that this could only be done if there was a reasonable ground, such as a reasonable base probability. That is, that we believe any child would be in need of protection. Unlike the Department of Community Services interpretation of Children and Family Services Act, the child or children can be unknown. Sometimes we know there is a risk to children, but is it to any children that encounter risk? There can be an order be made if there is physical or sexual abuse to a child, and there can be an order if there is a substantial risk to a child, or children will be sexually abused or otherwise physically harmed. We know that substantial risk is a real chance of danger, and that has to be apparent in the evidence. So if the court is satisfied that there is the evidence of danger, they can intervene to protect the children. This puts the protection of children first, not the protection of adults, alleged abusers, adults, or others who may be accused of the same. If it isn't wise to have someone near children, our court will now have an important tool for protecting our most vulnerable citizens. Because at East Preston, the evidence and need to act may arise quickly. There needed to be a way to act to protect children with speed, but without prejudice. So as with an injunction or an order on the Domestic Violence Intervention Act, the process begins with an application for an interim order, which is to be done on an ex parte. This means that the Department of Justice goes into presiding justice of the peace, presents evidence, and seeks an interim order to their own. Given the need to act before harm is done, there would need to be at least reasonable grounds to suspect children are in need of protection at this stage. If an interim order is granted, it will be reviewed by a Supreme Court judge, and if there's a good case, a full hearing will be scheduled. There are some times when getting our priorities right really matter. And Mr. Speaker, this really matters in the protection of our children, our most precious members of society. Yes, it may cause a person to be excluded from children out of an abundance of caution. Yes, that might result in some hardship. But protection of children must be paramount. Ask any parent. The cost of a child's suffering is immeasurable, and we know that. The law has guarantees of procedural fairness, except that justice of the peace and judges will need to weed out weak cases, and a hearing will clear up other matters. This act is an example of how the minister has squandered the opportunity for 4 legislative sessions over the last year and a half to learn from the East Preston situation and actually do something. Mr. Speaker, we need to enact this legislation so we can protect our most precious, most valuable, and most vulnerable members of society, and to protect the innocence of our children so that they can grow up to be productive members of society and not have those demons that could haunt them for the rest of their life. As in the case of Theo Fleury and others in society who've been involved in abusive cases. We need to let our children be children, and we need to provide them with all the chances of being who they are and who they strive to be. And Mr. Speaker, I know in the case of my own children, we do all we can do to make sure they get the best opportunities in life. Excuse me. We pay for good education. We give them all the best of protective equipment when they're playing sporting events. And this is just another tool to give them the protection they need. We wouldn't let a child ride a bicycle without a helmet. We wouldn't let a child play hockey without a helmet. And we wouldn't let our children drive a car without a seatbelt. This is just another way for us to show a little protection for our most vulnerable people in society. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to stand in relationship to Bill number 29. I think the intent is one that is good. I know I have 3 grandchildren, Claire and Grace and Nora, and all 3 of them are under 16. They range in age from 5 to 13. And I think the member, why would I talk this bill out before it would come to a vote? I think because it is folly, and it has been pointed out so clearly by 2 members of this House, from the member for Halifax Atlantic and the member for Halifax Clayton Park. Both of them, in fact, pointed out that this is a extra powers. It's something that has been designed without proper research, and there's probably a reason for that, because monies for research and researchers is based on the number of seats that you actually have in the legislature, and with 7 seats, I know there is limited resources for research, but this actually is about intervention, and it's about intervention of a nature that comes up with a whole secondary system. It's a secondary system that we are looking at here. And no criminal charges, restraining orders based on what looked probable, the extra powers that are involved in this.
Order, please. The time allotted for debate has now expired. I will now recognize the Honourable House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank all members for their lively debate today during opposition time. That concludes our business for today, and I will call on the Deputy Government House Leader to call for hours and our work for tomorrow.
Thank you. Then Chair now recognizes the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The orders of the day for tomorrow, following daily routine, we will be dealing with the Committee of the Whole House on Supply, and then public bills for second reading, bills 5, 9, 11, 13, 17, 20, 22, and 24. The House hours to be from 12 noon to 8 p.m. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The motion before the House is that we now rise and meet again tomorrow between the hours of 12 noon and 8 p.m. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. We now are at the hour of interruption. Tonight's late debate was submitted by the Honourable Member for Kings North. Therefore, be it resolved that the House support the continuation of gasoline regulation and cost sustainability in Nova Scotia rather than having pump prices for Nova Scotians set by big oil. The Chair now recognizes the Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to rise and speak to the issue of gasoline regulation, because once again we see some members of this House who have a selective memory when it comes to the regulations. Mr. Speaker, perhaps some of them were not paying attention during the summer of 2004 and 2005. And since that may be the case, I think a little history might be enlightening. I remember those days. I remember the conversations around my office. I remember the comments on the street when I met with people or when I stopped to buy gasoline myself. And Mr. Speaker, it didn't matter what political stripe an individual was, the concerns were the same. Mr. Speaker, consumers were upset for three main reasons. Firstly, the price of gasoline was going steadily up. Sometimes the price would jump up and down 2 or 3 cents a litre on the very same day. And it didn't make sense to consumers. They were angry because they felt they were being taken advantage of. Secondly, there didn't seem to be anyone looking out for consumers. Prices went up and prices went down, but there was never any real explanation offered for why that was happening. Consumers wanted transparency, and they weren't getting that from the oil companies for sure. Mr. Speaker, the third reason consumers were upset is because at times, prices in one end of the province were high and stayed high. And even when prices in other regions decreased, it often took 2 or 3 days before those decreases reached consumers in other regions. And in some cases, the price difference was as much as 6 cents per litre, so it was significant. And while all this was going on, and consumers were becoming more and more frustrated, gasoline dealers were crying out for help. They were slowly being squeezed out of business and leaving some communities with no local gas station. And I know that that's a fact, Mr. Speaker. In my area of Kings North, there used to be a significant number of places to buy retail gasoline. And in my memory, in my recent memory, those locations have been lost in villages and communities called Grafton and Woodville and Centerville and Sheffield Mills and Canning, which means a hardship for those particular communities and for many people who live in the vicinity. And because of that experience, retailers marched on the legislature and filled the gallery. They spoke, I know they did this, to every MLA who would listen. Mr. Speaker, Graham Conrad and the Retail Gasoline Dealers Association of Nova Scotia